The emerald caught the light from the crystal chandelier as my mother, Patricia, slid the vintage ring across the mahogany table toward me. Her manicured fingers lingered on the antique band for just a moment before she spoke the words that would ignite a war one never saw coming. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jessica, darling, she said, her voice dripping with that particular brand of condescension I'd grown up hearing. We need the ring back. It should have never left the family in the first place. Her eyes, cold as winter morning frost, never left mine as she delivered what felt like a final verdict on my worth as her daughter. I stared at my grandmother's emerald ring, the same ring that had been placed on my finger during what I thought was the happiest day of my life, now sitting between us like a green-eyed accusation. The same ring my mother had insisted I wear when I married David Thompson, telling me it would bring me the same marital bliss that had blessed the Martinez women for 3 generations. The same ring I'd clutched during the worst moments of my marriage, drawing strength from its legacy of enduring love. My father, Robert, cleared his throat from his position at the head of the dining table, his real estate empire having taught him that silence often spoke louder than words. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man accustomed to closing deals and shutting down opposition. The divorce changes things, Jessica. The ring represents family unity, something you've clearly demonstrated you can't maintain. Before I could even process the full impact of their demand, my brother Michael chimed in from across the table, his voice carrying that familiar note of superiority that had colored our entire childhood. Come on, Jess. You had your chance at happiness and you blew it. The ring should go to someone who can actually make a marriage work. He gestured vaguely toward his own wedding band, as if his 3-year marriage somehow qualified him as an expert on eternal commitment. The irony was suffocating. Here I was, sitting in the same dining room where I'd announced my engagement 5 years earlier, where they'd celebrated David's tech company success and my apparent good fortune in landing such a promising husband. The same room where my mother had gushed about finally having a daughter-in-law worthy of the Martinez name, conveniently forgetting that I was actually her daughter, not her daughter-in-law. But what they didn't know, what none of them could have possibly imagined as they sat there in their Westfield mansion demanding I surrender the last tangible connection to my grandmother's memory, was that their golden boy son-in-law had just made me one of the wealthiest divorced women in Connecticut. What they couldn't fathom was that while they were busy writing me off as another family failure, I had been quietly building a case that would not only secure my future but expose the rot that had been festering in the Martinez family foundation for decades. The ring felt heavier in my palm as I picked it up, its emerald center catching the light like a trapped star. I thought about my grandmother Elena, the woman who had built the Martinez real estate fortune from nothing, who had started with a single rundown property in Hartford and turned it into an empire that now stretched across 3 states. The woman who had worn this ring through the Great Depression, through my grandfather's early business failures, through raising 4 children, while building a legacy that would sustain generations. My mother had conveniently forgotten to mention that Grandma Elena had specifically left the ring to me in her will, with explicit instructions that it should go to the granddaughter who showed the most resilience in the face of adversity. She'd seen something in me even as a child that the rest of the family had somehow missed, or perhaps chosen to ignore. As I sat there in that opulent dining room, surrounded by the spoils of my grandmother's hard work and my family's inherited privilege, I realized that this moment wasn't really about a ring at all. It was about worth, about belonging, about who gets to decide what we deserve. It was about the fundamental question that had haunted me since childhood. Was I truly a Martinez, or just someone who happened to share their name? The crystal glasses filled with vintage wine seemed to mock me with their perfection, each one worth more than most people's monthly salary. The imported flowers, arranged with museum-quality precision, whispered of a world where appearances mattered more than authenticity. The Persian rug beneath my feet had probably cost more than my first apartment, yet somehow I felt like the poorest person in the room. But as I looked around at their expectant faces, waiting for me to meekly hand over what they considered their property, I felt something shift inside me. Maybe it was the memory of my grandmother's weathered hands teaching me to tend her garden, telling me that the strongest flowers bloom after the harshest winters. Maybe it was the echo of her voice reminding me that Martinez women don't surrender, they strategize. What my family was about to discover was that their discarded daughter had learned a few things about strategy during her marriage to David Thompson. They were about to learn that sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one who's been listening the most carefully, gathering intelligence, preparing for a moment exactly like this one. The ring caught the light one more time as I made my decision, and I could almost hear my grandmother's spirit whispering the words that would guide me through what was coming next. Show them what you're made of, Mija. Show them what a real Martinez woman can do. The drive from Manhattan to Westfield had taken exactly 2 hours and 17 minutes. Every mile bringing me closer to a confrontation I'd been avoiding for 6 months. The divorce papers had been finalized 3 weeks ago, but I'd needed time to process what my new reality meant. Time to understand the magnitude of what David's guilt and his company's explosive growth had deposited into my bank accounts. My sleek black BMW hummed along the Connecticut highways, its leather interior a cocoon of air conditioning and classical music that did nothing to calm the storm brewing in my chest. I'd made this drive countless times over the years, usually filled with dread about facing my family's passive-aggressive commentary on my life choices. Today felt different. Today, I was driving towards something that felt suspiciously like destiny. The text message from my mother had been characteristically brief. Family dinner Sunday, 6 o'clock. We need to discuss some family matters. No warmth, no inquiry about my well-being during what had undoubtedly been the most challenging period of my adult life. Just a summons delivered with the expectation of compliance that had defined my relationship with Patricia Martinez since childhood. I'd almost declined. The thought of sitting through another evening of subtle criticisms and pointed questions about my future plans made my stomach clench with familiar anxiety. But something Rosa had said during our last phone conversation kept echoing in my mind. Rosa Valdez had been the Martinez housekeeper for over 20 years, and she'd been more of a mother to me than Patricia had ever attempted to be. Sometimes, Mija, she'd said in her gentle, accented English, we have to walk back into the fire to prove we won't burn. The Martinez estate sat perched on Maple Ridge Drive like a monument to inherited privilege, its colonial facade gleaming white against the perfectly manicured landscape that stretched across 5 acres of Connecticut's most exclusive real estate. As my BMW crunched across the circular gravel driveway, I caught sight of the fountain my grandmother Elena had installed in the 1960s, its marble cherubs still spouting water in graceful arcs, despite decades of New England winters. The sight of it brought back memories of childhood summers when I'd sneak out to make wishes on fallen pennies, believing that if I threw enough coins into that fountain, my parents might finally notice me the way they noticed Michael. The imposing front door, painted in what my mother insisted was, quote, heritage burgundy, opened before I could even reach for the brass knocker. Rosa's familiar face appeared in the doorway, her warm brown eyes immediately scanning me with the practiced concern of someone who'd been bandaging my emotional wounds since I was old enough to walk. At 62, she moved with the efficient grace of a woman who'd spent decades managing the needs of a family that often forgot to manage their own humanity. "Aye, Jessica," she whispered, pulling me into a brief but fierce embrace that smelled of vanilla and the lavender fabric softener she'd used for as long as I could remember. "You look thin, Mija, too thin." Her weathered hands framed my face for just a moment, and I saw something in her expression that I couldn't quite identify. Worry, certainly, but something else. Something that looked almost like fear. "I'm fine, Rosa, really." The lie came easily, polished smooth by months of practice. I wasn't fine. I hadn't been fine since the day I'd discovered David's affairs. Hadn't been fine through the brutal months of divorce proceedings. Hadn't been fine as I'd watched my marriage dissolve into a pile of legal documents and asset divisions. But Rosa didn't need to carry the weight of my failures, along with everything else she managed for this family. She studied my face with the intensity of someone reading tea leaves, and I knew she wasn't buying my performance. Rosa had an uncanny ability to see through the masks the Martinez family wore so expertly. It was probably why she'd lasted 2 decades in a household where emotional authenticity was treated like a communicable disease. "Your mother? She's been..." Rosa paused, choosing her words carefully. The staff in houses like these learned early that discretion wasn't just preferred, it was essential for survival. She's been asking many questions about your situation. About the divorce, about money. Her voice dropped even lower. About the ring. The mention of my grandmother's emerald sent a chill down my spine. I'd worn it every day since my wedding, through the good times and the increasingly frequent bad ones. It had become a talisman, a reminder that I came from a line of strong women who'd survived worse than unfaithful husbands and disapproving families. The idea that my mother was already planning to reclaim it felt like a violation I wasn't prepared to face. "What kind of questions?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. Patricia Martinez had always had an uncomfortable relationship with anything that represented independence or personal agency. She'd made peace with my grandmother's success only because it had ultimately served the family's financial interests. But a divorced daughter with her own assets and her own claim to family heirlooms? That represented the kind of unpredictability that kept my mother awake at night. Rosa glanced over her shoulder toward the main staircase, where I could hear the distant sound of my father's voice discussing what sounded like property values with someone on the phone. "She's been calling the lawyers, asking about inheritance rules, about what happens to family property when marriages end." Rosa's expression grew more troubled. "And she's been meeting with your brother. Long meetings in your father's study with the door closed." The implications hit me like a physical blow. Michael had always been the family favorite, the one who'd inherited my father's head for business and my mother's talent for social manipulation. But he'd also inherited their sense of entitlement, their belief that the world should arrange itself according to their preferences. If my parents were involving him in discussions about my personal assets, it meant they'd moved beyond disappointment into active interference. "How long has this been going on?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story, asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. The timeline probably coincided with the finalization of my divorce, when the details of David's settlement had become public record for anyone determined enough to dig through the legal filings. "Since the papers were signed," Rosa confirmed, "your mother, she got very quiet when she read about the settlement in that business magazine. Very quiet and very busy." She touched my arm gently. "Jessica, I think you should know they've been asking me questions too. About your finances, about what you might have told me about your plans." The betrayal stung, but I couldn't blame Rosa for whatever she might have shared. Her position in this house was precarious enough without adding accusations of disloyalty to my parents' growing list of grievances. And honestly, what could she have told them? I'd been careful to keep the full extent of David's settlement to myself, sharing the details with only my lawyer and my financial advisor. As far as my family knew, I'd received a comfortable but not spectacular divorce settlement, enough to maintain my lifestyle but not enough to fundamentally change my circumstances. They had no idea that David's tech company, the startup he'd been building when we met, had exploded into a billion-dollar enterprise during our marriage. They didn't know that his guilt over his affairs, combined with his lawyer's advice about avoiding a lengthy legal battle, had resulted in a settlement that exceeded anything I could have imagined when I'd first filed for divorce. $25 million in cash and stock options, along with properties in Manhattan and the Hamptons that were worth millions more. But somehow, my mother had gotten wind of at least part of the story. Patricia Martinez had always had an uncanny ability to sniff out financial opportunities, a talent that had served her well during her own marriage, but had made her children's lives infinitely more complicated. The thought of her calculating how to access or control my newfound wealth made my stomach turn. "They're in the living room," Rosa said, straightening my jacket with the automatic care of someone who'd been managing appearances for decades. "Your father finished his call a few minutes ago. They're waiting." I could hear voices now, the familiar cadence of my family's conversations. My mother's laugh, artificially bright and perfectly modulated. My father's deeper tones, probably discussing some aspect of the business that had consumed his attention for as long as I could remember. And underneath it all, Michael's voice, carrying that note of smug satisfaction that had colored our interactions since childhood. The living room had been redecorated since my last visit, transformed from the warm, slightly cluttered space I remembered from my youth into something that looked like it belonged in an architectural magazine. Everything was cream and gold and carefully curated, from the silk curtains that pooled in precise folds to the crystal vases filled with flowers that probably cost more than most people's grocery budgets. It was beautiful in the way that museums are beautiful, impressive and untouchable, and completely devoid of anything resembling genuine warmth. My parents were positioned like actors on a stage, my mother arranged elegantly on the ivory sofa, with her legs crossed at precisely the right angle, my father standing near the fireplace with one hand resting on the mantel in a pose that suggested both casual confidence and underlying authority. Michael sat in the leather chair that had once been my grandfather's favorite spot, and seeing him there felt like another small violation of memory. "Jessica," my mother said, rising gracefully to offer me the kind of air kiss that ensured her lipstick remained perfect. "You look." She paused, her eyes conducting the kind of comprehensive evaluation that had made my teenage years a special kind of hell. Different, more serious somehow. My father's greeting was characteristically brief, a nod and a handshake that lasted exactly long enough to satisfy social conventions without suggesting actual warmth. Robert Martinez had built his real estate empire through a combination of shrewd business sense and emotional distance, and he applied the same principles to his family relationships. I was a subsidiary that had underperformed expectations, worthy of basic maintenance but not significant investment. Michael's greeting was the most revealing of all. He stood when I entered, offered a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, and delivered a hug that felt more like a performance than an authentic gesture of sibling affection. "Jess," he said, his voice carrying just enough warmth to sound genuine to casual observers. "It's good to see you. How are you holding up?" The question might have sounded like genuine concern from anyone else, but I knew Michael well enough to recognize the calculation behind it. He was fishing for information, trying to gauge my emotional state and my financial situation without appearing too obvious about it. The fact that he was asking at all suggested that my parents had assigned him a specific role in whatever they had planned for this evening. "I'm doing well," I replied, keeping my voice level and giving away nothing. "Better than I expected, actually." Something flickered in Michael's expression, gone too quickly for me to interpret fully. But I caught it, that momentary tightening around his eyes that suggested my answer wasn't what he'd been hoping to hear. Whatever script they'd prepared for this evening, it apparently assumed I'd arrive broken and desperate, ready to accept whatever terms they offered in exchange for family support and financial assistance. They had no idea how wrong they were. Dinner was announced with the same formality that had characterized every Martinez family gathering since my childhood. Rosa appeared in the doorway with the quiet efficiency that had made her indispensable to my parents' carefully orchestrated lifestyle, informing us that the meal was ready to be served. The dining room had been set with the good china, the Waterford crystal that only appeared for special occasions, and enough silverware to suggest that this evening was meant to be memorable for reasons I was only beginning to understand. The mahogany table that dominated the dining room had been in my grandmother's family for over a century, its polished surface reflecting the light from the crystal chandelier that my mother had imported from Austria at a cost that could have funded a small business. Every element of the room spoke to generations of accumulated wealth and refined taste, from the oil paintings of long-dead Martinez ancestors to the Persian rug that had supposedly once belonged to a European nobleman, whose name my mother dropped into conversations whenever she wanted to remind people of the family's distinguished pedigree. My usual seat was still available, the chair that had been mine since childhood, positioned at my father's right hand but somehow always feeling like the least important spot at the table. Michael occupied the place of honor across from me, the position that had been his birthright from the moment he'd arrived 3 years after me, and immediately claimed the attention and approval that I'd been desperately seeking my entire life. My mother held court at the opposite end of the table from my father, her posture perfect, and her smile fixed in the expression of gracious hostess that she'd perfected over decades of corporate dinners and charity fundraisers. The conversation during the first course was aggressively pleasant, the kind of superficial exchange that my family had elevated to an art form. My father discussed recent developments in the Connecticut real estate market, with the enthusiasm of a man who'd spent 40 years turning other people's property needs into personal profit. My mother shared updates about her various charitable committees and social organizations, each story carefully crafted to highlight both her generosity and her connections to Westfield's most influential families. Michael contributed tales from his own real estate ventures, the smaller-scale projects that were meant to establish his credentials as the natural heir to the Martinez business empire. I participated in this choreographed conversation with the skill of someone who'd been trained from birth to navigate the subtle currents of family diplomacy. I asked the right questions, made the appropriate observations, and offered just enough personal information to satisfy basic social requirements without revealing anything substantial about my current circumstances. It was a performance I'd been perfecting for 32 years, the careful balance of engagement and self-protection that allowed me to survive these gatherings with my sanity intact. But I could feel the tension building beneath the polite surface, the sense that everyone at the table was waiting for something to happen. My mother's questions about my life in Manhattan were just a little too pointed, her interest in my future plans just a little too intense. My father's comments about the importance of family loyalty and financial responsibility seemed directed at me with unusual specificity. And Michael's frequent references to his own stability and success felt like deliberate comparisons designed to highlight my recent failures. By the time Rosa began serving the main course, a perfectly prepared rack of lamb that probably cost more than most families spent on groceries in a month, the undercurrents of conversation had become impossible to ignore. My mother's smile had taken on a sharp edge that I recognized from childhood, the expression she wore when she was preparing to deliver criticism disguised as concern. My father had adopted the tone he used during business negotiations, measured and authoritative, and completely inflexible. Michael was practically vibrating with anticipation, like a hunting dog waiting for permission to retrieve his prey. "Jessica," my mother began, setting down her wineglass with deliberate precision, "we've been thinking about your situation quite a lot lately, about what this divorce means for your future, and for the family as a whole." Her voice carried the kind of false sympathy that had made my teenage years a special kind of torture, concern wrapped around judgment like silk around a knife blade. My father nodded gravely, as if he'd been losing sleep over my personal welfare, rather than calculating how my changed circumstances might affect the family's financial and social standing. "It's been a difficult time for all of us," he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone making a profound sacrifice. "Watching you go through this ordeal, seeing the impact on your stability and your reputation, we want you to know that we're here to support you through this transition." The word transition hung in the air like a threat. In Martinez family vocabulary, transitions were never organic processes of growth and change. They were managed events, carefully controlled movements from one predetermined state to another. When my parents talked about supporting me through a transition, they meant they were prepared to help me accept whatever new role they'd decided I should occupy in the family hierarchy. Michael leaned forward slightly, his expression radiating the kind of brotherly concern that had never existed between us during our actual childhood. "The thing is, Jess, we're worried about you. About your judgment, your decision-making. The divorce proves that you're not ready for certain kinds of responsibilities." He gestured vaguely around the dining room, encompassing the accumulated wealth and status that surrounded us. "This family has worked for generations to build something lasting, something stable. We can't afford to have that threatened by impulsive choices or emotional decisions." The implication was clear enough to make my blood pressure spike, but I forced myself to maintain the same neutral expression I'd been wearing all evening. They were building a case for their ultimate demand, constructing a narrative that would justify whatever they were planning to ask for. In their version of the story, I was an unstable divorcee whose poor judgment posed a threat to family assets and reputation. They were the responsible guardians of inherited wealth and social standing, reluctantly stepping in to protect what their ancestors had built. "What exactly are you suggesting?" I asked, my voice carefully controlled. I already knew the answer, but I wanted to hear them say it explicitly. I wanted them to own the words that would define our relationship going forward. My mother reached across the table and placed her hand over mine, a gesture that might have looked affectionate to an outside observer but felt like a restraint to me. "Darling, we think it might be best if certain family assets were returned to more stable hands. At least temporarily, until you've had time to rebuild your life and demonstrate that you're ready for the responsibilities that come with our family legacy." There it was. The word temporarily was meant to soften the blow, to make their demand sound reasonable and reversible. But I knew my parents well enough to understand that temporary arrangements had a way of becoming permanent when they served the family's interests. Once they regained control of whatever assets they were targeting, those assets would never leave their direct supervision again. "We're particularly concerned about grandmother's ring," my father added, his tone suggesting that this was a minor detail rather than the central issue. "It's been in the family for 3 generations, and it represents values of commitment and stability that don't align with your current circumstances." The accusation hit me like a physical blow, all the more painful for being delivered in such measured, reasonable tones. They weren't just questioning my judgment or my financial responsibility. They were attacking the fundamental legitimacy of my place in the family, suggesting that my divorce had somehow disqualified me from carrying on the Martinez legacy. The ring wasn't just a piece of jewelry to them, it was a symbol of worthiness, and they decided I no longer deserved to wear it. Michael nodded solemnly, adding his voice to the chorus of family concern. "The ring should go to someone who can honor what it represents. Someone who understands the importance of family stability and long-term commitment." He glanced meaningfully at his own wedding ring, the simple gold band that represented his 3-year marriage to Sarah. A perfectly acceptable wife who'd never challenged family expectations or made inconvenient demands for independence. "We're not trying to punish you," my mother continued, her voice dripping with the kind of false compassion that had made my childhood a psychological minefield. "We're trying to protect you. And protect the family. Surely you can understand that." I understood perfectly. I understood that they'd been planning this conversation since the moment they'd learned about my divorce. I understood that they'd researched the legal implications of family property and inheritance law. I understood that they'd positioned Michael as the responsible alternative, the stable son who could be trusted with family treasures, while his unstable sister worked through her emotional and financial difficulties. What they didn't understand was that their timing couldn't have been worse. What they couldn't have imagined was that while they'd been scheming to reclaim family assets from their supposedly impoverished daughter, that daughter had been quietly becoming one of the wealthiest women in Connecticut. What they'd failed to consider was that their carefully constructed narrative of my instability and dependence was about to collide with a reality that would shatter every assumption they'd made about my circumstances and my future. Rosa appeared in the doorway, her expression carefully neutral as she began clearing the dinner plates. But I caught her eye for just a moment, and I saw something there that looked like anticipation. She'd been watching this family operate for 20 years, had seen them manipulate and control, and diminish anyone who threatened their carefully maintained balance of power. She knew what they were doing to me, and she knew it was wrong. As my frivolous mother reached across the table to slide my grandmother's ring toward herself, her fingers confident and possessive, I realized that this moment represented something larger than a dispute over jewelry. This was about who gets to define worth and belonging. This was about whether I would accept their assessment of my value as a Martinez daughter, or whether I would finally show them exactly what their discarded child had accomplished while they weren't paying attention. The emerald caught the light from the chandelier one last time as my mother's hand closed around it, and I felt something fundamental shift inside me. The last vestiges of the obedient daughter who'd spent 32 years seeking their approval finally died in that moment, replaced by something harder and more determined, and infinitely more dangerous to their carefully ordered world. I watched in fascinated silence as my mother examined the ring with the practiced eye of someone appraising valuable property. She held it up to the light, turning it slowly to catch the full fire of the emerald, her expression one of satisfaction mixed with something that looked disturbingly like relief. This wasn't just about reclaiming family assets, I realized. This was about erasing the evidence of my brief moment of equality, about restoring the natural order where I remained forever in their debt and under their control. "Of course, we understand this is difficult for you," my father said, his voice carrying the tone of someone making a generous concession. "The ring has sentimental value, and we don't want to seem heartless about your attachment to it." He paused, letting his words settle like dust on the polished table surface. "But sentiment can't override responsibility. Family assets need to be protected by family members who've demonstrated the wisdom to protect them. The word wisdom stung more than I'd expected. It was my father's favorite weapon, the suggestion that my choices reflected not just poor judgment but actual stupidity. He'd been using variations of this attack since I was old enough to have opinions that differed from his. Always delivered with the calm authority of someone whose success gave him the right to pronounce judgment on everyone else's decisions. Michael cleared his throat, preparing to deliver what was obviously his assigned portion of the family intervention. Look, Jess, nobody's saying you're a bad person, but you have to admit that your track record with important decisions hasn't been great lately. He gestured broadly, encompassing my entire existence as evidence of failure. The marriage, the way you handled the divorce, your decision to move to Manhattan instead of staying close to family. These aren't the choices of someone who's thinking clearly about long-term consequences. I found myself marveling at the elaborate construction they'd built around their greed. They'd managed to convince themselves that stealing my inheritance was actually an act of compassion, a necessary intervention to save me from my own poor judgment. The psychological gymnastics required to frame theft as protection was impressive even by Martinez family standards. What we're proposing, my mother continued, her voice taking on the reasonable tone she used when discussing charitable donations at her committee meetings, is a temporary arrangement. The ring stays in the family, properly protected, while you focus on rebuilding your life and demonstrating that you're ready for the responsibilities that come with family legacy. She smiled with the kind of synthetic warmth that had made my childhood feel like living in a museum display. Think of it as us taking care of something precious until you're in a position to take proper care of it yourself. The condescension was breathtaking. They were talking to me like I was a teenager who'd crashed the family car, rather than a 32-year-old woman who just navigated one of the most complex divorce settlements in Connecticut legal history. They'd somehow convinced themselves that my marriage's failure erased every other accomplishment in my life, that my personal disappointments automatically disqualified me from managing family property. And how exactly would I demonstrate this newfound responsibility? I asked, genuinely curious about the criteria they'd established for my rehabilitation. What would I need to do to prove I'm worthy of wearing grandmother's ring again? My parents exchanged a look that lasted just long enough to confirm they'd discussed this question extensively. My mother's smile became even more artificially bright, the expression she wore when delivering news she knew wouldn't be well received. Well, darling, we think it would be beneficial for you to spend some time closer to home, maybe move back to Westfield, get involved in the community again. Show that you're committed to family values and stability. The trap was beautifully constructed. They wanted me back under their direct supervision, where they could monitor my finances, control my social connections, and ensure that any future decisions met with their approval. The ring wasn't just collateral, it was bait, designed to lure me back into the suffocating embrace of their expectations and limitations. Of course, there would be conditions, my father added, as if he were discussing the terms of a business loan rather than my personal autonomy. Regular family meetings to discuss your progress, involvement in family business activities to demonstrate your commitment to our shared interests. Think of it as a probationary period, a chance to prove that you've learned from your mistakes. Michael nodded enthusiastically, playing his role as the supportive brother who only wanted what was best for his struggling sister. We've actually been talking about bringing you into the business in a more formal capacity. Nothing too demanding at first, just administrative work, filing, maybe some client relations. It would give you structure, purpose, a steady income, while you figure out your next steps. The offer was designed to sound generous, but I could see the reality beneath the surface. They wanted to transform me into a dependent employee, someone whose livelihood depended entirely on their goodwill, and whose professional identity would be subsumed into the larger Martinez enterprise. The ring would remain forever out of reach, always conditional on my continued compliance with their vision of who I should be. We've even talked to some people about potential housing arrangements, my mother added, her enthusiasm building as she painted a picture of my diminished future. There's a lovely apartment above the Thompsons' garage, nothing fancy but perfectly adequate for someone starting over. And Janet Morrison mentioned that her garden club could use some help with their fundraising activities. It would be a wonderful way for you to reconnect with the community. I could see my entire future mapped out in their words. A small apartment, a make-work job, a social life constrained by their connections and their approval. I would become a cautionary tale, the Martinez daughter who'd reached too high and fallen too far, now grateful for whatever scraps of dignity her family was willing to provide. The ring would hang forever over my head like a carrot on a stick, always just out of reach until I'd proven myself sufficiently diminished and compliant. But what made the whole performance even more grotesque was their apparent belief in their own benevolence. They genuinely seemed to think they were rescuing me, offering a lifeline to someone who would otherwise drown in her own poor decisions. The fact that they were simultaneously robbing me of my inheritance and my independence seemed irrelevant compared to the generous opportunity they were providing for my moral rehabilitation. Naturally, we'd expect you to be discreet about the family's private business, my father said, his tone carrying the weight of a legal disclaimer. The real estate market is competitive, and our competitors would love to exploit any perception of family instability. Your situation has already attracted some unwanted attention, and we need to manage that carefully. There it was, the real concern that had been driving this entire intervention. My divorce hadn't just been a personal failure. It had been a public relations nightmare for a family that had built its reputation on stability and success. The business magazine that had covered David's settlement had mentioned my maiden name, connecting my personal drama to the Martinez real estate empire in ways that made my parents deeply uncomfortable. They needed me contained, controlled, and preferably invisible, until the scandal died down and people stopped connecting my messy personal life to their pristine business reputation. The ring was just the most obvious symbol of their larger project, the complete erasure of my independence, and the restoration of their absolute authority over every aspect of my existence. My mother reached across the table and patted my hand with the kind of gesture that was meant to convey maternal concern, but felt more like a claim of ownership. I know this seems overwhelming right now, sweetheart, but you'll see that we're right about this. Family takes care of family, but only when family members are willing to accept the guidance and protection that comes with that care. The ultimatum was clear, even wrapped in the language of love and concern. Submit to their control, accept their assessment of my worth and capabilities, and I could remain a Martinez daughter in good standing. Continue to assert my independence, insist on my right to make my own decisions and manage my own property, and I would be permanently cast out of the family circle. What they couldn't possibly have known as they sat there outlining the terms of my surrender was that I'd already been cast out in every way that mattered. Their approval had been withdrawn so many times over the years that I'd stopped seeking it long before my marriage ended. Their financial support had always come with strings attached that made it more burden than blessing. Their version of family love had been so conditional and manipulative that I'd learned to find genuine affection elsewhere. The only thing they had left to take from me was the ring, and even that loss would be temporary if I played my cards correctly. Because while they'd been scheming to reduce me to a dependent, grateful supplicant, I'd been building something they couldn't touch or control or take away. I'd been becoming the kind of wealthy, independent woman who could buy and sell their entire social circle without breaking stride. Rosa appeared in the doorway again, this time carrying the dessert service on a silver tray that probably cost more than most people's cars. Her movements were precise and professional, but I caught the slight tension in her shoulders that suggested she'd been listening to enough of the conversation to understand what was happening. She set the tray down with unusual force, the crystal glasses chiming against each other in a way that sounded almost like a warning bell. As she served the individual portions of tiramisu, each one perfectly arranged on bone china plates that had been in the family for 3 generations, I found myself thinking about inheritance and legacy in ways I'd never considered before. These people had built their entire identity around the accumulation and protection of beautiful objects, treating family relationships like asset management and love like a limited resource that had to be carefully distributed according to merit and compliance. But sitting there, watching my mother polish my grandmother's ring with her napkin as if she were already erasing any trace of my ownership, I realized that they'd misunderstood everything about what makes a legacy worth preserving. They thought power came from controlling beautiful things and managing other people's choices. They had no idea that real power came from building something so substantial and independent that it couldn't be taken away by family politics or social pressure or emotional manipulation. The ring caught the light one more time as my mother slipped it onto her own finger, testing the fit with obvious satisfaction. She held her hand up admiringly, turning it this way and that, to appreciate the way the emerald complemented her perfectly manicured nails and expensive jewelry. "There," she said, with obvious pleasure. "It looks much better on someone who can properly appreciate its significance." That was the moment I knew exactly what I was going to do. I reached into my purse with deliberate slowness, watching their faces as I withdrew the leather portfolio that contained the documents that would change everything. The silence in the room was complete except for the soft ticking of my grandmother's antique clock on the mantelpiece, the same clock that had counted down the minutes of my childhood in this house, marking time until I could finally escape the suffocating embrace of their expectations. "Before we finalize any arrangements," I said, my voice carrying a calm authority that I'd never used in this dining room before, "I think there are some things you should know about my current situation. Some details about the divorce settlement that might change your perspective on my need for family protection and guidance." My mother's expression shifted slightly, a tiny crack appearing in her mask of maternal concern. She'd clearly expected me to either break down in grateful tears or storm out in impotent rage. She hadn't prepared for cool, controlled negotiation from someone who appeared to be holding cards she couldn't see. "Jessica, darling," she began, her voice taking on the condescending tone she used when she thought I was being dramatic. "We're already aware of your financial situation. David was generous, we're sure, but divorce settlements aren't permanent solutions. They're temporary bridges while you rebuild your life in more modest circumstances." I opened the portfolio and withdrew the first document, sliding it across the polished mahogany surface toward my father. It was a bank statement from my private wealth management account, the numbers typed in the conservative font that financial institutions use when they want to convey serious money rather than flashy wealth. The balance showed $27,400,000 in change. My father's eyes widened as he processed the number, his usual composure cracking for just a moment before he recovered his businessman's poker face. But I'd seen that flicker of shock, that instant when his assumptions about my circumstances collided with a reality he hadn't anticipated. "This is just one account," I said conversationally, as if I were discussing the weather rather than a fortune that exceeded their combined net worth. "David's company went public 6 months after our separation was finalized. The stock options that were part of our settlement turned out to be significantly more valuable than anyone had projected." I withdrew the second document, a portfolio summary from my investment management firm that detailed holdings across multiple asset classes: real estate in Manhattan and the Hamptons, blue-chip stocks, municipal bonds. A diversified collection of investments that would generate more passive income in a single year than most people earned in their entire careers. Michael's mouth had fallen open slightly, his usual smugness evaporating as he realized that his supposedly desperate sister was sitting on liquid assets that dwarfed his own modest real estate ventures. The golden boy who'd spent his entire life being praised for his business acumen was suddenly looking at someone whose net worth made his accomplishments seem quaint by comparison. "The total settlement," I continued, enjoying each word as it landed like a physical blow, "was $25 million in cash and securities, plus properties valued at an additional $12 million. David's lawyers were very motivated to avoid a lengthy court battle, especially once they understood that I had documented every one of his affairs and had recordings of him discussing business deals that might have interested federal regulators." My mother's hand had gone to her throat, an unconscious gesture that I remembered from my childhood whenever she encountered something that threatened her carefully constructed worldview. The ring on her finger suddenly looked different, less like a reclaimed family treasure and more like a piece of costume jewelry compared to the wealth I'd just revealed. "But that's not all," I said, withdrawing the third document from my portfolio. This one was a letter of intent from a major Manhattan real estate development firm, detailing their offer to bring me on as a partner in a billion-dollar mixed-use project on the Upper West Side. It turns out that having significant capital to invest opens doors that weren't available to the daughter who needed her family's approval for every major decision. The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced in this house. For the first time in my memory, my parents were completely speechless, their usual arsenal of judgments and criticisms rendered useless by the simple reality of numbers that spoke louder than their disapproval ever could. Rosa, who had been quietly clearing the dessert plates, paused in her work to catch my eye. For just a moment, her professional mask slipped, and I saw something that looked remarkably like pride. She'd watched them diminish and control me for 20 years, and now she was witnessing my emergence as someone who could no longer be diminished by anyone. The interesting thing about wealth at this level, I continued, my voice growing stronger with each revelation, is how it changes people's perceptions of your judgment and your character. The same investment advisors who might have been condescending to a divorced woman with modest assets are suddenly very eager to take my calls. The same social circles that might have viewed me as damaged goods are now sending invitations to galas and charity boards. I withdrew another document, this one a letter from the Board of Directors of Connecticut's most prestigious children's hospital, formally inviting me to join their major donors circle and consider chairing their next capital campaign. The irony wasn't lost on me that they were offering me the kind of social prominence my mother had spent decades trying to achieve through smaller donations and networking events. "I've been thinking a lot about legacy lately," I said, letting my gaze move around the table to take in each of their stunned faces. "About what it means to honor family history and carry forward the values that previous generations worked so hard to establish. Grandmother Elena built this family's fortune from nothing, starting with a single piece of property and growing it into an empire through intelligence, determination, and an absolute refusal to let anyone else define her worth." My mother's face had gone pale, the perfectly applied makeup unable to disguise the shock that was radiating from her in almost visible waves. She was beginning to understand that this wasn't just about money. This was about power, about the fundamental shift in our family dynamics that came with my newfound independence. "She left me the ring," I continued, my voice taking on the tone of someone stating facts rather than making arguments. "Not because she thought I was the most deserving granddaughter, but because she recognized something in me that the rest of the family had missed. She saw someone who would honor her legacy by building something independent and substantial, rather than simply managing what others had created." I reached across the table and gently but firmly removed the ring from my mother's finger. She was so stunned that she offered no resistance, allowing me to reclaim what had always been mine by right and by inheritance. The emerald felt warm against my palm, as if it had been waiting for this moment of restoration. "The ring stays with me," I said, slipping it back onto my own finger where it belonged. "Not because I need it as a symbol of family acceptance, but because I've finally proven myself worthy of what it represents. Independent strength, financial security, the ability to make decisions based on my own judgment rather than other people's approval." My father found his voice first, though it came out as more of a croak than his usual authoritative tone. "Jessica, we had no idea about your circumstances. If we'd known about the settlement, about your investments, we never would have suggested—" "What?" I interrupted, genuinely curious to hear how he planned to finish that sentence. "You never would have suggested that I was too irresponsible to manage family property? You never would have offered to protect me from my own poor judgment? You never would have assumed that my divorce automatically disqualified me from carrying on the Martinez legacy?" The questions hung in the air like accusations, each one highlighting the fundamental assumptions they'd made about my worth and my capabilities. They'd been so certain of my failure, so convinced of my need for their guidance and control, that they'd never bothered to investigate the actual facts of my situation. Michael cleared his throat, trying to recover some semblance of his earlier confidence. "Look, Jess, maybe we misunderstood the scope of your settlement, but that doesn't change the fact that you're inexperienced with managing large amounts of money. Having wealth and knowing how to preserve it are two different things entirely." I almost laughed at his attempt to maintain the narrative of my incompetence, even in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. "You're absolutely right," I said, pulling out yet another document. "Which is why I've been working with Chen, Morrison and Associates, the same wealth management firm that handles the Rockefeller family's investments. They've been very impressed with my understanding of portfolio diversification and long-term financial planning. The letterhead on the document was enough to make my father straighten in his chair. Chen, Morrison and Associates didn't work with nouveau riche celebrities or lottery winners. They managed old money, the kind of generational wealth that required sophisticated strategies and absolute discretion. The fact that they'd accepted me as a client was a stronger endorsement of my financial acumen than any business degree could have provided. They've also been advising me on philanthropic strategies, I continued, enjoying the way each new revelation seemed to shrink my family's sense of superiority. Apparently, when you have assets at this level, charitable giving becomes both a social responsibility and a tax optimization strategy. I'm planning to establish a foundation focused on supporting women who are rebuilding their lives after divorce or domestic violence. My mother's sharp intake of breath was audible across the dining room. She'd spent years building her reputation as a charitable patron, carefully cultivating relationships with Hartford's social elite through her committee work and fundraising activities. The idea that I could instantly surpass her influence through the simple application of serious money was clearly devastating to her sense of social position. The foundation will be funded with $5 million initially, I said, watching their faces carefully, with plans to grow that endowment substantially over the next decade. I'm particularly interested in supporting legal aid organizations that help women navigate complex divorce proceedings and asset protection strategies. The barb was subtle but unmistakable. I wasn't just announcing my charitable intentions. I was highlighting the expertise I'd gained during my own divorce, expertise that had enabled me to secure a settlement that exceeded their wildest imagination. I was also implicitly criticizing the kind of shallow charity work my mother preferred, the kind that generated social recognition without addressing systemic problems. Rosa had stopped pretending to work entirely, standing motionless by the sideboard as she watched the complete reversal of family power dynamics playing out in real time. Her expression was carefully neutral, but I could see the satisfaction in her eyes as she witnessed the people who'd treated her as invisible furniture, suddenly rendered speechless by someone they'd consistently underestimated. Of course, I continued, establishing a foundation requires board members, people with demonstrated commitment to the cause, and unquestionable integrity. I've been thinking about inviting some of Connecticut's most prominent women to serve, people whose reputations for ethical behavior and genuine compassion would lend credibility to the organization's mission. The implication was clear enough to make my mother flinch. She would not be invited to serve on any board I controlled, her history of manipulative behavior and conditional love making her precisely the kind of person my foundation would exist to protect women from. Her decades of careful social climbing had positioned her as someone whose reputation depended on association with the right causes, but my money could create new social hierarchies that didn't include her. My father was beginning to recover from his initial shock, his businessman's instincts kicking in as he processed the implications of my newfound wealth. "Jessica," he said carefully, "I think we may have approached this evening in the wrong way. We were operating under incomplete information about your circumstances, and we clearly underestimated your financial sophistication." I could see him recalculating, adjusting his assessment of my value to the family, now that I represented opportunity rather than liability. The man who'd been ready to relegate me to a garage apartment and make work job was suddenly seeing potential for business partnerships and investment opportunities. The transformation was both predictable and pathetic. "What I'd like to propose," he continued, his voice taking on the tone he used when pitching deals to potential investors, "is a fresh start. A recognition that you've achieved something remarkable with this settlement, and a conversation about how your success might benefit the entire family. Perhaps there are ways we could collaborate. Projects where your capital and our experience could create something bigger than either could achieve alone." The audacity was breathtaking. 5 minutes earlier, he'd been lecturing me about responsibility and offering to manage my life like I was an incompetent child. Now he wanted to be my business partner, to find ways to access the wealth he'd just tried to steal through emotional manipulation and family pressure. "I appreciate the offer," I said, my voice dripping with the kind of false sincerity they'd taught me through years of painful example. "But I'm afraid my investment advisors have been very clear about the importance of separating personal relationships from business decisions. They've seen too many family fortunes destroyed by mixing emotional dynamics with financial partnerships." Michael leaned forward, his desperation beginning to show despite his attempts to maintain his usual arrogance. But we're not just any business partners, Jess, we're family. We understand each other, we share the same values, the same commitment to building something lasting. That has to count for something. Does it? I asked, genuinely curious about his answer. Because 15 minutes ago, those same family values led you to support taking away my inheritance because you believed I was too unstable to be trusted with family property. Those same shared values made you comfortable with the idea of reducing me to a dependent employee who would need to prove her worthiness through compliance and submission. The words hit their target with precision, each accusation landing like a physical blow. They couldn't deny what they'd been trying to do because I'd heard every word, had sat through their entire presentation about my inadequacies, and their generous willingness to manage my failures. Their sudden change of heart now that they understood my actual financial position only highlighted the conditional nature of their family love. My mother made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation, her voice taking on the pleading tone I'd never heard her use before. "Sweetheart, you have to understand that we were only trying to protect you. We thought you were vulnerable, that you needed our help to navigate this difficult period. If we'd known about your success, about your financial security, we never would have suggested anything that might have seemed controlling or patronizing." "But that's exactly the problem," I replied, rising from my chair with the ring secure on my finger and my portfolio tucked under my arm. "Your love and your respect were always conditional on your assessment of my need for your approval. When you thought I was weak and desperate, you were prepared to steal my inheritance and reduce me to a dependent child. Now that you know I'm wealthy and successful, you suddenly want to be my business partners and collaborators." I walked around the table, my heels clicking against the hardwood floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the suddenly oppressive silence. But real family love doesn't change based on financial circumstances. Real respect doesn't depend on whether someone needs your help or your approval. And real legacy isn't about controlling other people's choices. It's about giving them the tools and the freedom to build something meaningful on their own. Rosa stepped forward as I approached the dining room entrance, her professional mask finally slipping completely. "Miss Jessica," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion, "your grandmother would be very proud of you today. Very proud indeed." The words hit me harder than all of my family's desperate attempts at reconciliation combined. Rosa had known my grandmother personally, had worked in this house during the years when Elena Martinez was still building her empire and establishing the foundations of everything my parents now took for granted. Her approval carried a weight that their sudden change of heart never could. "Thank you, Rosa," I said, reaching into my purse and withdrawing a business card from my private wealth manager. "If you ever decide you'd like to explore other employment opportunities, please don't hesitate to call. I know several families in Manhattan who would appreciate someone with your skills and your integrity." The offer wasn't charity. It was recognition of value and loyalty that had never been properly rewarded in this household. Rosa had been invisible to my parents for 20 years, treated as furniture that happened to cook and clean and manage their daily lives. But she'd seen everything, understood everything, and maintained her dignity and compassion, despite being surrounded by people who viewed kindness as weakness. My parents sat in stunned silence as I walked toward the front door, their carefully planned intervention having backfired so spectacularly that they seemed incapable of formulating any response. The dining room that had witnessed decades of family gatherings, celebrations, and carefully orchestrated emotional manipulations had just hosted the complete reversal of their understanding of family power and worth. As I reached the foyer, I turned back one final time to look at the people who had shaped my early understanding of love and loyalty and family obligation. They looked smaller somehow, diminished by the revelation that their discarded daughter had not only survived their rejection, but had thrived beyond their ability to comprehend or control. "I want you to know," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the house that had once felt like a prison but now seemed like just another expensive building filled with beautiful objects and hollow relationships, "that I don't hate you. I don't even blame you anymore. You gave me exactly what I needed to become the person I was meant to be, even if that wasn't what you intended." The front door closed behind me with a soft click that seemed to echo with finality, sealing off one chapter of my life and opening another. The evening air was cool and sweet, with the scent of my grandmother's rose garden, the flowers she'd planted decades ago still blooming despite changes in ownership and care. Some legacies, I thought, are strong enough to survive even the people who inherit them. As I drove down Maple Ridge Drive for what I suspected might be the last time, I caught a glimpse of Rosa in my rearview mirror, standing in the doorway and watching my departure with something that looked remarkably like liberation. The ring on my finger caught the light from the street lamps, its emerald fire reflecting all the dreams and possibilities that stretched ahead of me like an open road. My phone buzzed with a text message from Amanda Chen, my lawyer, confirming our meeting the next morning to discuss the final details of my foundation's legal structure. Another message from Karen Walsh, my financial advisor, contained preliminary numbers for a real estate investment opportunity that would expand my portfolio into commercial development. A third message from the hospital board thanked me for my interest in their capital campaign and suggested a lunch meeting to discuss my potential leadership role. The world was full of people who wanted to work with me, to learn from me, to benefit from the resources and expertise I'd developed during the most difficult period of my life. I was no longer someone who needed protection or guidance, or carefully managed opportunities for rehabilitation. I was someone who could create opportunities for others, who could build something lasting and meaningful from the ashes of my family's limited vision of what I could become. The highway stretched ahead of me, leading back to Manhattan and the life I'd built far from the suffocating embrace of inherited expectations. Tomorrow, I would begin the work of establishing my foundation, of using my resources to help other women escape the kind of emotional and financial manipulation I'd finally learned to recognize and resist. I would build something my grandmother would have been proud of, something that honored her legacy of independence and determination, while extending that legacy to people who had never been given the privilege of family wealth or social position. The ring felt warm on my finger, no longer a symbol of belonging to something outside myself, but a reminder of the strength and resilience that had always been my true inheritance. My parents had tried to steal that inheritance, to reduce me to a dependent child who would need their approval and their management to survive. Instead, they had given me the greatest gift possible, the absolute certainty that I was capable of building something extraordinary without their help, their approval, or their love. The city lights of Hartford glowed in my rearview mirror, marking the distance between my past and my future. And for the first time in my adult life, that future felt completely and entirely my own. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.